Hello, and welcome to this webinar on science versus pseudoscience, translating science to practice. My name is Asker Jeukendrup. I'm a professor of exercise metabolism at the moment at the University of in Loughborough. I've got a background in sports science or exercise physiology and biochemistry. And today I will be talking about the science and the pseudoscience that we have in sports nutrition. That is, if I get my slides to work, yes. So I work as a consultant within my company, My Sports Science, where I try to use the science and the research that we have from many studies and then apply it in the real world, ultimately to help athletes. And I do this as in a consultant role now. I work with a number of teams and organizations. For example, the Dutch Olympic Committee. I oversee nutrition for the Dutch teams. I work with professional cycling team with a number of football clubs, but always the task is to take the science and translate it into something practical. Now, before we get to the translation part, which is hopefully towards the end of my talk if we have time, I want to talk about the science and the pseudoscience that we have in this field. So the first question I want to address is, why do we need science in the first place? Why do we need to be evidence-based? And to illustrate that question, I'm going back to a story. And I got interested in this whole field because cycling was my sport. These are the heroes from the time when I grew up. And a few years later, I ended up working in elite cycling. And I remember the first days I was entering the team as a scientist to help them with sort of evidence-based methods. But at the time, this was a very conservative sport. And I was probably one of the few, maybe the first scientist to work in professional cycling. So I was definitely approached or I entered professional cycling with I was welcomed, but at the same time people didn't or the riders didn't really know what to do with the information. They weren't really accepting that a scientist could just come in and tell them what to do. So in this really conservative world, it was difficult to convince them that science was important. The older riders, or this is how it worked in cycling, the older riders and the more successful riders, they would tell the younger riders what to do, and this is how everyone learned. And it was basically from generation to generation, the habits were just passed on. But there was very little science, very little questioning of those practices. So I had a conversation with one of those riders who'd literally won everything there was to win, and who was extremely skeptical. And I said, why don't you think that the science is important? He says, well, what is it going to tell me? I've won everything. And I've worked out what works for me. I said, well, how did you work that out? He said, well, I tried various things and over the years, and now I know what's best. I said, have you tried things that didn't work? And the answer was, of course, yes, I tried many things that didn't work. I said, well, in a way, that is science too. You do an experiment with yourself, you try something that doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, you don't use it again. If it does work, you may build on it. And this is how you developed what you're using today. And gradually he was understanding that actually maybe by listening to some of the science and some of the studies that have been done, maybe I can avoid making some of these mistakes, and certainly younger riders can avoid making some of these mistakes. So this is a different way of looking at it. If this is the sports nutrition landscape, one thing that most athletes have clear is where their target is, where they need to go, where they want to go, or where they want to be. So if the target in this case is here, they need to find a way to get to that target and navigate this sports nutrition landscape. And it could be that on that journey there is a nutrition company offering them some money for endorsement. So they start using that particular product just because the company knocks on their door. Then they read a magazine, and the magazine tells them something about nutrition. So they change their diet a little bit because it made sense what the magazine said. Another company comes in and says, we offer you a free test, and you can do this hair analysis, and we'll tell you exactly what you need to eat. Then we have so Miley Cyrus on social media saying gluten is crap. So that's the time to remove gluten from the diet. We have game changers, and that's the time that we start to eat plant-based. Then the physio says something and has an opinion about what the athlete should eat. And then the athlete changes the diet, but actually has a bad race, which means changing the diet completely again. Maybe changing it to the diet of another athlete who actually performed really well. So the journey looks a little bit like this. It is definitely not a straight line to the target. And I think what we're looking for is to find a more direct way to get to the target. And I think that is exactly what evidence-based practice does. An evidence-based approach will result in a faster, more efficient journey to the target, and in fact, less trial and error. So why is the landscape of sports nutrition so confusing to athletes? There are many reasons, but I'm just going to share a few of those reasons with you. The first one is that, especially in the field of nutrition, there are many opinions. The second one is that there is a lot of information, and a lot of that information is just misinformation. There are also many experts, some real experts, some maybe not so real. Then there is the element of trust, and athletes very often believe, well, if they claim that, it must be true, because if it's not true, they wouldn't be allowed to say it. And unfortunately, that's not always true. Science is becoming really important. Science sells. So everyone is now saying that scientific studies have shown this and that, and they do it without always understanding what science is, or at least their understanding is very limited. Also, we want things to be black or white, and that is something that I will come back to. And of course, extremes are very popular. So those are some of the reasons why there is a bit of confusion. The other reason is that we are just bombarded with messages through social media, through various outlets. There is an enormous amount of information that comes at us, and we have to make decisions very rapidly to like what information is usable and what's not. If you just take the example of just going through Instagram or Twitter, and you're just scrolling through your phone, within fractions of seconds, you make decisions like this message is of interest and this message is not. And that brings me a little bit to like how our brain works, because that is responsible for part of the issues that we have. And of course, I'm going to oversimplify this very much, but hopefully it'll help to make things a little bit clearer. Our brain can be divided into two main areas. The first area is the sort of the instinctive brain, the part of the brain that is sort of the ancient part that helped us survive. It makes decisions really rapidly. it's also like very emotional. Then we have the reflective brain. It makes decisions much slower, but it is the part of the brain that got us to the moon. It is instead of being emotional, it's very rational. The instinctive brain can make decisions really quickly, but it does it by putting things into boxes. Things need to fit into a box. It needs to be black or white, otherwise it can't make the fast decisions. And the reflective brain accepts that it's not always black and white. There are many shades of gray, but this is a process that takes a lot of time and is extremely slow. And if we're scrolling through Instagram, then it is mostly the instinctive brain that has to make the decisions for us. There's very little time to do that, to read carefully worded scientific messages. It is more about just like the headlines that grab your attention. And on the basis of that, you make quick decisions. And therefore, what we do is we put information that we get into certain boxes, and this is just an example of trends that we have in the media. And I should also say that not all of this is evidence-based, but you can see here a jar for green, which is all the stuff that we think is good, and then we have a jar that is red for everything that we think is bad. Now we see on the green side, protein at the moment fits definitely into the green jar. Fat fits into the green jar, whereas a few years ago fat was in the red jar. That was the thing that we should definitely avoid. Now it's more accepted and it's moved into a different jar. We have milk sits actually on both sides, as you can see. There is a bit of discussion about that. And then superfoods, that sits definitely in the green jar, even though it's just a marketing term. It's not a scientific term. And then another interesting one is that ultra pure supplements, that is what we should be looking for. Ultra pure supplements. Well, ultra pure supplements are the most processed foods that you would get, and processed foods actually sit in the red jar. So there's a little bit of confusion here. Gluten fit into the red jar as well, and of course salt, and the worst of all, sugar. So it is black or white. It has to be good or bad, otherwise we can't understand it. And if we want to distinguish good information and bad information, and I didn't get any funding from a credit card company to put this slide together. If we have to distinguish good and bad information, it is important to understand that bad information can be because of several reasons. The first reason could be that the science behind it is bad. And sometimes that is the case. But more often, it's actually the science is okay, but the reporting of the science is bad. And then there's a third reason sometimes, and that is sort of maliciously misleading information. Those are companies that are really trying to sell to you and don't mind lying to you as a customer. And then on the good information side, of course, good science and good reporting will result in good information. And you can immediately appreciate that it is much easier to generate bad information than it is to do and good science and good reporting of that information. And here's just an example of sort of something that is really common in the interpretation of science. And it is the example of the Easter egg. And I always wondered where the Easter eggs came from until I read the book by Anthony Warner, The Angry Chef. And in the book, he explains that in sort of March, April time, you see the hares in the fields and it's mating season. So they're jumping around and you suddenly see them appear. The whole year you don't see the hares, but in March and April they seem to be everywhere. And when you walk through the fields, you see these little holes in the ground that could come from the hair, from the pores of the hair with some eggs. So in medieval times, they made that connection. They saw the hairs at the same time as these eggs disappeared, and concluded that the eggs had to come from the hair. Whereas in reality, the eggs came from the lapwing, a bird that you would never see because it's very shy. So as soon as you would come closer, the lapwing is just long gone. So it's understandable that in medieval times they made the link between the hair and the eggs, and that later became the bunny, and the eggs became chocolate, and they got some colorful wrapping, and that's what we see at Easter time now. The lapwing, in this case, is the confounding factor. Some more sort of science examples. We have here sugar intake and obesity prevalence, and if you see these two lines, the immediate conclusion, at least by the instinctive brain, is that, well, sugar must cause obesity. And I've plotted everything till the year 2000, because after that, sugar intake actually came down a little bit and obesity continued to rise. So maybe it's not that simple. We could also plot fat intake versus obesity, and we get a very similar relationship. But concluding that fat intake is the cause of obesity is also an oversimplification. And we simply cannot draw such conclusions from a correlation graph. And to make that maybe even clearer, here's obesity plotted against bottled water. And you can see there's a pretty good correlation between these two lines. But at the same time, we also realize that it is very unlikely that bottled water intake caused obesity. And if you want to have some fun with correlations, you can go to this website, Spurious Correlations, and you can find all sorts of really strong correlations. In this case, the correlation between the US spending on science, space, and technology, and there is a very good correlation, 0.99, with suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. And obviously those things are not related at all, but correlation is very strong. Now we have a lot of bad science or non-science, pseudoscience, and I'm going to use the example here of oxygenated water because this is something that sort of keeps coming back. Sometimes it disappears for a little while and then it keeps popping up. Here are a number of products that are on the market that you can buy where the water is oxygenated. Why do we need oxygenated water? Well, you can just go to the website and you will find that everyone knows that water is life and oxygen is life too. That's not necessarily a scientific explanation of why we need water, but to a lot of the consumers it makes sense. Life and oxygen and water, that all sounds pretty good, and it makes intuitive sense, at least to the instinctive brain. Why you need oxygenated water? Well, if you read a little bit more on this on the website, then you can see, and this is typical for pseudoscience, that some of the more emotional arguments are formed. In this case, our environment is becoming so polluted these days that not even the air we breathe no longer contains as much pure oxygen as it used to. Well, scientifically, I think that could be challenged because the amount of oxygen or the concentration of oxygen in the air hasn't changed for millions of years. But because we now bring in pollution, we bring in emotion, we get angry that things are polluted, and we need oxygen to clean it. And the second part, this rapid decline of available clean oxygen, which also suggests that there must be something as dirty oxygen, also results in the loss of oxygen in our food. And so clearly the average person is not getting as much oxygen as they should. Well, I'm not sure about the physiology here, but I'm not sure how much oxygen we get through our food versus inhaling it through our lungs. And then specific to sport, there's some claims achieving. Why do we do it? Well, it helps you to achieve and maintain a good hydration level of the body with smaller amounts of water. Makes me think as well. Reducing and degrading of lactic acid in the muscles, that must be a good thing. Increasing hemoglobin levels, improving tissue respiration, reducing tissue hypoxia. I doubt that that sentence means a lot to the vast majority of people who read this. And then improving recovery after several physical and mental stress. And of course, each of these statements, you would have to check the evidence, and I can promise you that you can't really find that evidence. So let's look at what the evidence is. Water is actually normally oxygenated already. So tap water or bottled water, doesn't matter, about 8 milligrams of oxygen per liter of water. Now, it is also possible to increase the amount of oxygen in the water. You do it by putting oxygen in there under pressure. And per atmosphere of pressure, you get about 40 milligrams of oxygen into the bottle. The problem is, of course, like what happens when you open that bottle? You've just put the oxygen in there under pressure, and now you open the bottle, and of course, as soon as you open it, the oxygen is gone. But if we assume that that wouldn't happen and you actually ingest it, the next question is, of course, what happens with this oxygen in the stomach? We can't absorb oxygen in the stomach. We have lungs that are designed to take up oxygen, but the stomach is not. So suppose that you drink 1 liter of water. Suppose that when you open the bottle, no oxygen escapes. And suppose that the stomach can actually absorb this oxygen. Then you would get 40 milligrams of oxygen for every atmosphere of pressure in the bottle. Well, I would say, why don't you just simply breathe in an extra liter of air, because that will give you an extra 146 milligrams of oxygen, and it's free. So the arguments are completely bogus. So if we compare science versus pseudoscience, I think this slide is going to make the differences pretty clear. And unfortunately, this is the only slide that I have that has quite a bit of text. On the left, science, on the right, pseudoscience. In science, all our findings are expressed through scientific journals. Those journals are peer-reviewed. They maintain rigorous standards for honesty and accuracy. And yes, I am aware that the system doesn't always work. There are papers published that shouldn't have been published because the standards weren't maybe as high, or someone didn't do a very good job. But in general, there is a system in place to double check that the information that goes in there is correct. Pseudoscience, well, first of all, the audience is very different. They communicate directly to the public. There's absolutely no review, there are no standards, there's no one who demands accuracy or precision. Second point is that in science, it's all about reproducibility. If someone shows something once, it doesn't really mean anything. You have to be able to reproduce those findings. And also you need to describe your methods so that someone else can actually redo the study and confirm your findings. In pseudoscience, the results can never be reproduced or verified. The studies are always very vaguely described, if at all, with the reason that then no one can actually figure out what was done. The next point on science is that failures are searched for and studied closely. So we're actually looking for things that are not in alignment with our thinking. With pseudoscience, failures are ignored. So for example, if someone said or tested the oxygenated water and the effect would not be positive, then those findings would be ignored, or they would be hidden, or they would be lied about, explained away, etc., etc. Science is also moving on. So as time goes on, more and more is learned about the physical processes that we study, and therefore the textbooks just keep changing. Whereas pseudoscience, there are books from the 60s, for example, that haven't been changed at all, nothing, not even a word. So no progress is made. Science convinces by appeal to the evidence, whereas pseudoscience convinces by appeal to faith and belief, and it really tries to convert rather than to convince. And then finally, on the science side, it doesn't really advocate or market unproven practices or products, whereas pseudoscience, people generally make a living out of those questionable products. And those products could be books, they could be courses, they could be certain supplements or services. So here's the summary. Pseudoscience, it's really about fraud, stories, collection of personal experiences and beliefs, and science is about evidence, facts, and statistics. So now let's look at what exactly is science. And as I said at the beginning, I think this is a question that most people have an idea that they know what science is, but in my experience, if you ask people what science is, you get a huge variation in answers. And science is really, it refers to a process. You can see the process here. It's a process of accumulating knowledge or a system of knowledge about sort of general truths, and it's obtained and tested through scientific methods. It starts with observing or reading up on a topic. So you need a certain amount of information. Then based on that, you formulate an hypothesis. You then design a study so you can test if you are right. You then have to perform a rigorous experiment to find out if you're right. And then if those findings of the study show that you're not right, that means that you have to modify your hypothesis and the whole thing starts again. If you were right, then we've added a little bit to the theory. And that process will go on and on and on. Every time we get a little bit closer, hopefully, to the truth. So what is evidence-based practice in sports nutrition? That is making a conscious effort to base decisions on research that is most likely to be free from bias and use interventions that are likely to improve athletes' performance. So the goal really is always to improve performance. Now, another problem is that I always say that everyone who eats and drinks seems an expert in nutrition these days. And I think that really is true. There are so many people that just voice their opinion as an expert opinion. But usually what we are dealing with is anecdotal information. Here are just 3 examples that are not sports nutrition related. The first one is smokers are much more likely to get lung cancer. And then someone responds, that's not true. My grandfather smoked his whole life and never got lung cancer. That is anecdotal information. It's not the same as evidence. The first statement is probably based on an analysis of the literature, all of the information that we have. The second one, similar, overloaded electrical outlets increase the risk of a fire. That's not true because I have 6 appliances plugged into one outlet and never had a fire. Anecdotal information. Another one, A results in B 90% of the time. And the answer would be, that's not true. I know of this one time when A did not result in B. So clearly the sentences in red are a little bit less scientific and have a little bit less weight than the ones in gray, which are based on a body of evidence. Here are some sports nutrition ones. There is evidence that a ketogenic diet improves performance. There's no evidence that a ketogenic diet improves performance. That's not true. I've been on it for weeks and really feel the difference. And then here, there's no evidence that removing meat from a diet improves performance or recovery. That's not true. My friend went vegan and feels much better. So, and this is something that, especially in social media, we have to deal with constantly. So, and of course, these anecdotes are the lowest level of evidence that we have. They sit here at the bottom, together with ideas, expert opinions, editorials, and so on. Then we have case reports, cross-sectional studies, and it goes all the way up to the top, where we have experiments and meta-analysis. And meta-analysis are particularly strong because, and it's the highest level of evidence because it looks at all of the studies, the totality of the literature. Whereas anecdotes is just one observation in one person. But the problem very often is not so much the science. Well, the problem is very often the science, but even more often the problem is the bad reporting of the science. And here's just an example. There's actually a website here that is dedicated to articles that have appeared in this one newspaper, where in this case it is about the causes of cancer. There are hundreds of articles on the various causes of cancer, and so I'll take you through some of these. The common cold is a major cause of childhood cancer. Wine can double the risk of cancer. Sun cream causes cancer. I also thought that not using sun cream caused cancer. City living causes cancer. Mouthwash containing alcohol increases mouth cancer, and also Pringles. So you can find hundreds of these articles, and they change because one day wine is good, the other day wine is causing cancer. And why is that? There are many reasons for this. I'll come back to that in a second. I'll show you one other example that is in the area of sports nutrition. And it's actually a study that a friend of mine conducted. And I think it's actually a pretty useful and a pretty cool study, a very simple study. What they did is they looked at glycogen synthesis post-exercise. Glycogen synthesis post-exercise, obviously very important for recovery. But in this case, they wanted to know, does the source of the carbohydrate matter? Does your body know whether it comes from fast food or from a specifically designed sports food? So they compared fast food with the same carbohydrate, fat, and protein content with a sports food with the same carbohydrate, fat, and protein content. They measured muscle glycogen, and they observed that it was lower after exercise, and then 4 hours later, glycogen synthesis had occurred. In both cases, there was no difference between fast food and sports food, and therefore the conclusion was your body can't really tell the source of the carbohydrate. It just needs a certain amount of carbohydrate to synthesize glycogen. They also measured insulin over a 4-hour period and blood glucose, and also found no difference between those two treatments, where carbohydrate, fat, and protein content were matched. And this is my friend Brent Ruby, who initiated the study. Now the headline the next day was, "Doctors say fried chicken is good for you." So something that wasn't even investigated. So first of all, they didn't even look at fried chicken. It was a different company they looked at. They used McDonald's in that study. And also the doctors didn't say it was good for you. The doctors said glycogen synthesis was similar with the two foods post-exercise, as long as the carbohydrate, fat, and protein content were matched. But of course, that wouldn't make a very sexy title, and it wouldn't help you sell or get people to click on your links and visit your website. So very bad journalism. Here are some of the causes, I think, of bad reporting. It's well, first of all, it's all about headlines. Lazy journalism is a second one. Sometimes it's just people just haven't read the science. They've maybe read part of the abstract, maybe just the conclusion in the abstract, and based on that they write some article. Sometimes I think journalists write the article but really don't have enough understanding of the topic. Sometimes it is about just simply the lack of understanding of what science is and how science works. And then very often I see extrapolations. So the study is in one population, but the results get extrapolated to everyone or to a completely different population. The study results of one particular study are explained versus looking at the totality of evidence. So sometimes you see a headline and it describes one study, whereas there are actually 100 studies on that same topic that show something completely different. But the paper or the article is only about that particular study and doesn't discuss, and that's the next point, the context. The lack of context, I think, is one of the biggest issues, that sometimes the studies are interpreted completely out of context. And because I think the context is so important, I show you an example here of my daughter's favorite program, Peppa Pig, very popular in England. And in this particular episode, the message of the program was, well, spiders can't actually hurt you. You don't need to be afraid of spiders. So, and that's what Daddy Pig tells Peppa. You don't really need to be afraid. And at the end of the episode, Peppa says, "Oh, we're all going to have tea with Mr. Skinny Legs." She's not afraid of spiders anymore. Now, this episode was well received in England. In Australia, it caused outrage because in Australia, spiders are, like, this is the redback spider. It's one of the smallest and deadliest spiders in Australia. So this is not a message that they would give to their children. And in fact, it may be the last message they would give to their children. So the context here is extremely important. Now, in nutrition, we have a lot of these things that we have statements about breakfast is important, carbohydrate is important, drinking is important, creatine improves performance. Well, yes and no. And I think in all of these cases, the answer is it depends. Breakfast is important. Well, if I am going out to train my fat metabolism, the last thing I want to do is have a breakfast, because that reduces my fat metabolism and I won't be training my fat oxidation. Carbohydrate is critical. Well, similar story. In some cases, carbohydrate is critical, sometimes for performance, sometimes for recovery, but in other situations, it's not critical at all. If you're not exercising a lot, carbohydrate is not critical at all. If you want to train your fat oxidation, you should avoid it. Drinking is important. Well, you should avoid dehydration, severe dehydration, but not in all cases is drinking important. Creatine improves performance. Well, what performance? Maybe if it's intermittent exercise performance of high intensity, but if it is endurance performance, creatine doesn't do anything. So the context is really important, but gets often missed out. So that just describes the issue. The next question is, like, what can we do about it? How can we defend ourselves against sort of the pseudoscience, the misinformation, and all the sort of the nonsense that's out there? And maybe we are well equipped to do this, but how do we help our athletes to be better equipped? And I think generally there are 3 layers of protection. The first one is what I call a quick superficial scan. The second one, slightly more in-depth analysis. And then the third one is a full scientific evaluation. Let's look at those. The first line of defense, this is the most important one, and this is the one that everyone should master. It is, you can detect a lot in the language that is used. A lot. You can also look at the source. You can look at conflicts of interest. You can question whether there's an agenda. If there are conspiracy theories, very often you're dealing with pseudoscience. If emotional arguments and exaggerations are used, those are really signs of that you're not dealing with a scientific piece of work. If any one of these flags up red, it's not necessarily a problem. There are many really good studies where there is a potential conflict of interest, but it hasn't actually affected the results of the study. Still important to sort of flag these things up, and if you have 3 or 4 or 5 red flags, then it becomes really important. The second line of defense, you need to have a little bit more skill for this. You need to look at the source. You need to see, is it peer reviewed? You need to have a look at the study design, the interpretation of the results, things like the correlation that we talked about, or is a correlation or causation, and a number of things that probably require a little bit more skill. And then the next layer is you have to do a full scientific evaluation, and I appreciate that this is probably not something for everyone. This means a screening of the entire literature, looking at meta-analysis, a detailed evaluation of the context, and a deep understanding of the underlying mechanisms, and deep understanding also what the different experiments have done. Of course, this is not for everyone. So let me summarize this first part, and then we move into sort of the application. And I've done this in tweet-sized conclusions, so they're nice and short. So the first one is, evidence-based practice offers the tools to make fewer mistakes and a faster way to better results. The second one is about context. The truth must have context. Context is really important, really is everything. Bad science happens, but the real problem is bad reporting of science. And then the last one, it is an essential skill to read critically, think critically, and also to be able to distinguish good from bad information. So now, the last few slides, I'm going to talk about translating science to sport, and this is something I could talk about for a very long time, but I just want to give you some of the highlights. And I just want to illustrate what the issue is that we still have today. So on this, in this slide, you see the scientist on one side, and we have the athletes on the other side. And this is the gap that we're talking about. And the scientist is thinking, how do I get this published? They're all they care about is their publications, because that is how their success is measured. If they publish a lot, they'll be successful. The runner says, how do I run a PB? They don't care about publications. They just want to run as fast as possible. And then we have the practitioner who sort of sits in between. The practitioner tries to give the advice based on some of the science to the runner who wants to run a PB. But they're often questioning, well, how do I not fall? How do I sort of read and interpret all the information from the scientist? How do I translate this to the runner? How do I make sure that the runner that I work with is happy? So the constant battles. The scientist speaks a different language than the athlete. The athlete says, hey, how do I get the ball in the back of the net tomorrow? Very simple question. It shows some urgency because the match is tomorrow. We can't wait until several studies have been conducted 3 years later and been peer reviewed and everything. So the scientist, on the other hand, says AMP kinase and glycogen phosphorylase might be connected, and more studies are needed to be definitive. Always sitting on the fence, speaking a language probably the athlete cannot understand. So we definitely need some urgency. We need some translation of that language to something the athlete can practically use. The process of taking science to practice is really, it starts with the research papers here. The research papers get translated into review papers, and review papers probably into papers with guidelines. And then we have a translation step. People, I do this as well on my sports science, we turn it into infographics. But when we go from the research papers to the reviews to infographics, we lose some of the context, we lose some of the details. And of course, an infographic about like hundreds of studies in just one image cannot contain the same amount of information as the 100 original research papers. So there are possibilities here for error in this process. Now, all of this is based on research, and that research is based on ideas and hypotheses that are formulated. And it could be that the research is done because we want a quick publication. The research is not always done because we want to help the athlete, and therefore maybe not always the right questions are asked. The questions are asked so that you can find differences or explain a mechanism. The questions are not asked so that you can then help the athlete. Another step is we need to take the guidelines that we have and turn it into actual foods. The guidelines are usually in grams or grams per kilogram or calories, but we need to translate into foods, into supplements, the doses, the timing, etc. And that's not an easy step. But the more difficult step is actually the next one, is like once you have that, how do you change the behavior of the athlete? And that's what we should spend a lot of time on. And then we need the input from the athletes. That goes back to the idea and restarts this process. So the problems with this process are extrapolation, how much evidence is enough, individualization, the study design, context, and behavior change. At all of those steps, there could be an issue with the translation from science to practice, interpretation of results and averages. I'm just going to skip through this next step, which is about how much evidence is enough, because that is a judgment call. And I have this here for a number of supplements, some with more evidence, some with less evidence. And as a practitioner, you have to draw a line and say, this is where the evidence is enough, and all the rest I'm not going to use because there is not enough evidence. I'm just going to go very quickly to my conclusion slide. So there's a lot of bad information and misinformation, sometimes difficult to distinguish good from bad information. Pseudoscience can look like science, and we really need to look out for bad science. And with that, I'm just going to wrap up here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much. Okay, I can see questions now. I'll start with the first question. Do you have a tip for communication of gray zone answers from research to black and white information to athletes? I think it's just really important to always stress that there never is a black and white. it is always trying to educate athletes a little bit more about the gray zones, and that they need to understand and just learn also more about nutrition, so that because the more you're educated and the more you understand the background, the more that you can accept that there are gray zones. But the gray zones is also where for athletes the opportunity lies, because if you're doing your general nutrition really, really well, you're operating in this gray zone. Not every day is the same. That this is something that most athletes can understand really well. Training is different on different days. Goals are different on different days. So you're always operating in this gray zone. Hopefully that was okay. The fasting diet, well, there are many different types of fasting diets. Intermittent fasting is sort of the most talked about recently. And in fact, what that does is that you just reduce the time during the day that you eat. But the first question I would ask is why are you considering a diet? What is your outcome goal? And this is like, we need to understand the context. Is it for weight loss? Is it for performance? Is it to improve training adaptations? And depending on the answer to that, the diet may either have no value at all or a negative value, or it could help. And I think in terms of weight loss, it may there is not a lot of evidence, but it may help certain people who benefit from reducing their time to eat, and it helps them to manage calories. But it's really not much more than that. For other purposes, I don't think there is much of a role at all. Ketones. Yeah, it's a long answer to talk about the science behind ketone supplementation. I would refer you back to my website on mysportscience.com, where I have addressed the issue a couple of times. But the reality is that we don't have huge amount of information on ketones. And I'm talking exogenous ketones now at the moment. There are like essentially two categories: the ketone salts and then ketone esters. I think the evidence on the ketone salts is really not convincing at all. So, and the ketone esters are extremely expensive. They are much better tolerated. You can ingest them in larger amounts and therefore maybe expect greater effects. But the studies are really not conclusive. So I think it's very early. It's very early days, and probably too early to actually draw any conclusions. Let's see. Correlation of causation is often misused or that carte blanche to dismiss results we don't like. Well, maybe that's true, but I think in no cases can you actually make that assumption that if there is a correlation that there is causation. So it is it is not just an easy way out. You always need to back this up by a little bit more. You cannot draw any conclusions just on the basis of correlations. Of course, if you have the correlation and then a number of studies at the same time that show a more mechanistic explanation, then of course it becomes a little bit more important, and that's what I refer to as the totality of evidence. If I talk to my clients as a dietitian, how can I educate them what to believe and what not to believe? This is super important question. It's also got a lot of likes. So this is essentially maybe that's the next webinar, but it is essentially, when I was talking about the 3 layers of sort of protection against misinformation, the first layer being all the sort of the basics. It's the things like the language and all the red flags that you need to identify. I think this is something that not just sort of dietitians, practitioners should learn, but also athletes. And I believe that this is essentially becoming a little bit more like a scientist. I always say this to athletes and also to dietitians. It's like, in some ways, athletes and dietitians just need to become more like a scientist. They need to think more like a scientist, and they need to understand things a little bit more like a scientist. So you can identify all of these red flags much easier. But it's a separate webinar to go into, like what these red flags are, how do you recognize them. So maybe that's and one of the things I do on my website is I try to like constantly use examples of this, of how you can recognize it. And so maybe not enough time to answer this now in one question, but I do think it can be taught relatively easily, and it's extremely important. What are examples of pseudoscience in sports nutrition? Gosh, where do we start? There are so many, I think. I've just made a list last week of 90 myths in sports nutrition, and it goes from like we need to eat low carb. Well, why do we need to eat low carb? You can come up with all sorts of theories, and those theories are usually because you can increase fat oxidation. Then, okay, the next question is, why do you want to increase fat oxidation? Does that make things better? And yes, you can spare your glycogen. Well, do you need to spare your glycogen? So there are like a lot of these questions around diets in particular. I mentioned like hydration as one of those things. It's like we need to drink. Well, no, we don't. It depends. You need to drink with purpose, and you need to be informed. Carbohydrate in the hour before exercise is bad. You need to avoid it. That's a myth that's been around for a very long time. You need very large amounts of protein to gain muscle. There's another myth. Gosh, there are so many. Let's see, what else do we have? Do you recognize that it's becoming more and more difficult to publish a neutral study? Yes, I think I do recognize that, and of course that causes a publication bias in the literature. I think it depends a little bit on the journal, but unfortunately, I see this trend in the same trend that you see in newspapers. You also see this a little bit in the journals, I think, and it's really unfortunate that they just want to publish studies that get a lot of attention in the press. It's not just about reporting scientific information anymore. It's also like what happens after that, how much publicity can we gain with this. So I do recognize that as a problem. I think a lot of scientists do recognize this issue. Do I have a ready answer? No, unfortunately not. And I think that's actually brought me to the end of the list of questions. So I'm probably gonna thank you for your attention. Hopefully it was useful. If I've made you think, then I think I've achieved my goal. Maybe I've given you some information as well, but it was mostly aimed at making you think and about like how important critical reading, critical thinking is. So thank you very much, and maybe see you next time.